From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by A Cloud Guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have both of us this week. Brian, how you doing, man?
I'm great, man. It's good to have you back. It's good to, we've done a couple here in the last couple of weeks, so it's kind of good to get back into that rhythm.
Yep, absolutely. And the one big thing to kind of chat about real quickly before we get into our guest for the week is you had mentioned it on another show, but we don't have links in the show notes just yet. Maybe we will between when we record this and when we publish it, but it's Krispy Kreme challenge time of the year. So look out for more information on that real soon. The registration for the race has opened up. And if you're been listening to the show for a number of years, you know what that's about. But just in case you're new this year as well, it's a run for charity that Brian and I do every year here in Raleigh, North Carolina. The proceeds go to the North Carolina Children's Home. But it's an interesting race. It is Krispy Kreme challenge. So that means run 2.5 miles, eat a dozen donuts, run 2.5 miles back. Try and keep them down. So it's an interesting concept. We kind of take one for the team for charity every year. And so look for more information on how the community, if you would like to help out, look for links on that real soon.
Yeah, and we have always been really, really blessed with the community. The community has raised, I think now we've been doing this about 5 years now. I think the community's raised over $20,000 or $25,000 for the North Carolina Children's Hospital. So it's a huge honor for us to kind of go represent the community, and it does so many good things for families who unfortunately have kids who have come across diseases and sicknesses which are pretty debilitating to the family. So it's an awesome opportunity. Hey, listen, man, we have a chance today. We talk a lot about, where should we take the show and how many topics should we get into since cloud is now kind of mainstream. We have a chance today to dig into a topic that we've been wanting to deal with a lot, but it's just so big that it's really kind of well beyond our show. So we get to talk today about machine learning and artificial intelligence, which is really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So our guest this week is Sam Charrington, host of This Week in Machine Learning and AI podcast. How you doing, Sam?
I am doing great. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, doing fantastic. But yeah, I completely agree. It is awesome to one of our core tenets of the show is we'll be more than happy to raise our hand when we don't know exactly what we're talking about. And we try to bring on people much smarter than us. So thanks for coming on, Sam.
I appreciate the opportunity. I've listened to the show for a while, and I appreciate what you guys do, and especially what you guys do with the Krispy Kreme run. That is awesome.
Yeah. So Sam, we've sort of crossed paths with you for years and years now, kind of around the cloud circuit and events and so forth. You've been the last couple of years, you've been really focused around ML and AI, and you've got this incredibly successful podcast. It's sort of top 10 sometimes, top 20 sometimes in iTunes. Give us a little bit of your background, what you've been doing the last couple of years. Why you got fascinated with AI and ML, and tell us a little about the podcast as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I was kind of early on in cloud and ran product for a company that was kind of at the nexus of cloud and big data. And when I left that company, I started up Cloud Pulse Strategies, which is my industry research firm. I'm an industry analyst. But one of the very first areas that I focused on was machine learning and AI. And in the cloud space, I was always really excited about platform as a service. And it became really clear to me as enterprises had to deal with so much data that they would need a more intelligent platform, thus incorporating some of the ideas from AI and ML in order to help them build the types of applications that they would need to build to really take advantage of it. That led to, it's something that I'd followed in that capacity for years, but as the ML and AI space heated up, I started the podcast around a year and a half ago, just as a way to force myself to keep up. There's just so much happening all the time. And it's just one of these crazy things that you do because you really don't know. You really don't know how hard it's going to be quiet. Well, you guys know since you do a podcast, but I had no idea. But I just jumped in, started the podcast, and it's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, and I would say it's, jokingly say, what's it like with the view from the top up there? Having a podcast that has become so popular and has shot up in the rankings. And by the way, everyone go subscribe and listen if you are even vaguely interested in this topic. It's great. So let's kind of flip and let's start with the basics. So AI and machine learning always kind of get talked about as some kind of, think of it as like a spectrum. The things that we live with very basically, Google doing an auto search versus, SkyNet coming and Terminator stuff. And, we live on this kind of maturity curve of AI and ML. And tell us a little bit about that and how you view all of it.
Yeah, I think, I tend to think that for all intents and purposes nowadays, they're interchangeable, but here's the way I kind of parse that out. Artificial intelligence is, really about allowing or making computers do things that feel human-like. And there's this joke that it's a little bit of a kind of a moving goal line, right? So, we make the computer does something that is amazing and it's AI until we get used to it. And then it's just, what the computer does. And so things like, predictive text keyboards, right? When that first came out, it's like, wow, this thing knows what I'm going to say. It knows what I'm going to type before I type it. And now it's just something we expect. And so, that's kind of AI. And there are lots of ways to do AI. It's possible to make a computer do things that feel human-like just by building a whole bunch of rules into, some rule system. And for a long time, that's the way folks did this kind of stuff. What is more interesting, though, is when you incorporate machine learning into that. And that is really when you use data to teach the computer how to come up with those rules itself. And so I say the terms are more or less interchangeable now because I think all of the interesting action in AI is also in machine learning, right? It's when the machines you're using data to get the machines to program themselves essentially. And so good examples of each of these, like in, one of the spaces that I am, both fascinated and enamored by, but also, underwhelmed by at the same time is like the home assistant kind of thing, or the virtual AI assistant. So, I've got, Google Home, I've got the Amazon Echo, I've got a bunch of each of them actually around here. And they are amazing technology. You can talk to them. They understand what you're saying, right? For the most part. And they can even, tell you and do some interesting things based on what you're saying. There's still a bunch of work that needs to be done in terms of the, how they're hooked up into like information retrieval. Like there's, AI systems, like the AI is often a really small part of the overall system. And that's true in these kinds of things. And so I think when I think of like, what are the, what's AI that's like as close to, pure general AI, it's like these virtual assistants. And then machine learning, is involved in that, but there are also, some very kind of pedestrian types of examples of machine learning. Like if you use Redfin or Zillow to look for houses and, both of those systems will offer you estimates of what the value of a house is. That's all, based on machine learning. They're just taking in tons of data. They've got some data that tells them they've got, as homes are sold, right, they've got a market established value. So, what's called ground truth. And they can just, run those in a machine learning algorithm or a set of machine learning algorithms and apply that to houses that aren't sold yet, that are on the market, and use that to that algorithm to predict the value of those houses.
Gotcha. So let's talk a little bit about that technology. And again, assume maybe people are just sort of brand new to this. What are some of those core technologies that are behind AI and ML? What are some of the things that if somebody says, hey, I'm like you, I'm curious about this, I want to learn more about it. Like, what are some of those core technologies to kind of pay attention to and maybe that are accessible to people to kind of either learn or play around with?
Yeah, there's a ton of interesting stuff out there. So I guess I'll start by mentioning a term, deep learning, and talk about how that fits in. So deep learning, and actually to really talk about that, you have to take a step back and introduce this concept of a neural net. So a neural net is basically an approach to machine learning that is based around this biologically inspired model of a neuron. And this is an idea that goes back many, many years. But you basically can create this network of, these simple neurons, or at least mathematical neurons. And again, kind of this common theme, throw a ton of data at them. And, the neuron will essentially, or these networks will essentially figure out how to, map the input data to the desired data during the training phase. And then you can send unknown data to them, and then they'll make a prediction, right? So that's a neural net in a nutshell. Deep learning is a set of technologies and approaches that have become extremely hot over the past few years. And it's essentially taking these neural networks, which are typically like architected in layers, and just making them deeper, making them have more layers. And by making them have more layers, they can make more sophisticated decisions about the data that you give them. And so these deep, this idea of deep learning and these deep neural networks are behind a ton of the cool stuff that is happening in AI today. So, all over in, consumer apps like Facebook and in commercial apps, there are image recognition systems. So you can give think of it as giving an API an image, and it'll return to you, what's in the image with, varying probabilities. It can, answer questions about the image. There's a kind of visual question answering is one way that deep learning is used. You can, give it an image of a face, and it could try to predict the emotion that's being expressed. There's, tons of things that are happening around our ability to understand what is presented in visual images, and in fact, both static and video. And that's all powered by this idea of deep learning. It's one of the things that's really driving the popularity of machine learning and AI right now. And
so, Sam, it's really fascinating to me, and I'll give you a couple super practical examples. So I've recently, last couple months, flipped from Apple iOS over to Android, and it was just mainly because I was using Google services. It was nothing against Apple, but it was really
good for you.
It's really fascinating because my wife, because, in order to do like the equivalent of like FaceTime and iMessage and all these other things, you have to kind of flip over to the Google world, which is cross-platform. And right. So we were chatting on Allo the other day, but Allo does a certain amount of like, as you're chatting, it learns and it has these responses at the bottom. And it was the funniest thing. We were chatting back and forth, and I had no idea. And my wife was like, all I was doing was clicking the button at the bottom because it was correct of like what the next reply was. She was like, that was the freakiest conversation I've ever had.
Yeah.
And she's like, it's like Google knows what I'm thinking kind of thing, which is, and she was like, that was really awesome and really scary all at the same time. And then another one is Google Photos. You can just go into Google Photos and I don't know, give me a search of rock climbing pictures, right? And it'll pop up all the rock climbing pictures. And so it's really fascinating to see where not just Google specifically, although I think they're doing a really good job in leading the way right now, but that's where all of these consumer level services seem to be going. But I wanted to tie that into what you said about data. So we've got, data and these data models and we've talked on this show and going back to our cloud days, right? That whole concept of data gravity, right? And how does that really relate in your mind to AI and ML? Do you bring the data to the engine? Do you take the engine to the data? How do companies deal with that? Or is this something that is so early on there isn't even necessarily standards or standard ways of doing this yet?
Yeah, I think it plays pretty heavily into what we see happening in the industry. So, if you look and see who are the players that are investing heavily in machine learning and AI, and more than just investing, like really have strong offerings, the cloud vendors, in fact, all have very, very robust portfolios of AI and machine learning solutions, right? And I tend to think of them in three different buckets. They've got AI optimized infrastructure, typically, GPU based infrastructure or instances that you can spin up. They've got data science based environments. So Azure ML and Google's ML engine, these kinds of things. And they've got a set of APIs. And these are typically built around the cognitive types of functions. So, I described one, right? Give the API an image, it'll tell you what's in the image and spit back to you an array of, things that are likely in the image. There's sentiment analysis. There's, the emotional thing that I mentioned, what's the emotional content of an image. There's translation. These are all, at the high level API, at the API level. And, when you think about why this kind of the interplay between AI, ML, and cloud, and why the cloud vendors are investing so heavily into the space, I think, there are a few reasons, but I think one of them, really centers around this idea of data gravity, right? So to effectively train these models, it requires, lots and lots of data. One of the numbers that you hear thrown out is, in order to really to do something on the kind of deep learning side of things, you need at least 100,000 data points. And, often those might be images, those might be audio samples. That's a lot of data, and it's not something that you're going to want to be moving around a lot. And the cloud vendors are very familiar with this concept of data gravity. And that's why I think one of the reasons why they're fighting so hard to, win this business.
Well, and you bring up a great point there of I'm always trying to equate it back to things we've already known and already seen. Is there a market, in your opinion, and again, this is early days, but I almost equate it to public cloud versus, on-prem, infrastructure as a service, things like, say, OpenStack, for instance, right? An on-prem commodity component. Is there going to be because you need those big data pools, a lot of the AI and ML will happen in public clouds, or is there a consumerization, if you will, of companies are going to invest in AI or ML, locally or, on their prem?
Yeah. So it, like you said, you see the same things over and over and over again in this industry. And we're certainly, seeing that happen in, in regards to AI and ML, right? So just like folks did a kind of ROI analysis on the public cloud, and you had some, big use cases of folks pulling out of the public cloud because it was more expensive. You can do the same thing with regards to your AI workloads, right? So if you're spinning up a bunch of GPU instances on AWS, you're going to run up a pretty penny, not a lot of time. And you can, if that's something that you anticipate doing, frequently for a long period of time, you can do an analysis that tells you whether you should go out and, buy your own GPUs and build your own servers and kind of rack them and stack them. And, in the same, kind of argument, pro and con arguments come up, with regard to public versus private cloud, right? Like there's agility, there's, the ability to keep up with the latest and greatest, OpEx versus CapEx, all of that stuff, plays out here as well.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit. One of the things that comes up whenever we talk about AI or machine learning is, there's a lot of, especially the technologists, there's a lot of very positive things that can come out of this. The ability to gather data around, say, healthcare, make better diagnosis, do them faster, allow patients to get through doctor's office more quickly, or, find better fuel sources or energy, like all sorts of good things for either individuals or humanity. And then there's the kind of flip side of it, which is, you see things like kind of the famous example from a year or so ago where Microsoft put a bot out on Twitter, and it got a whole bunch of propaganda, and all of a sudden people were like, oh, it got trained immediately to learn how to spew Nazi propaganda, and so you get this weird kind of press coverage between, is AI a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And it tends to skew just based on whatever the headline is. What you've been sort of living in this world for a little while. Like, what's the sense you get? Maybe not so much from a morality perspective, but just how it's covered. Is it fairly covered in terms of the benefits to people in society versus where it gets maligned because some bad incident happens? I mean, what's your general sense at this point of how well people kind of figure out how it fits in their day-to-day life or society and so forth?
Yeah, I think the mainstream media coverage of it, while there's been some good, some really strong articles, there's also like tons of clickbait, right?
Sure.
And, a lot of it is, coverage of Elon Musk, for example, right? Who is like one of the, the folks that is kind of famously in this debate as someone who is, both, super smart and incredibly afraid of SkyNet.
Right.
Right. And so anytime he tweets about this topic, it sets off a flurry of, almost hysteria. So interestingly enough, I was in an event earlier this week, and I was pressed by somebody like, who are you in this debate? Are you Zuckerberg, who thinks like, Pollyanna, this is great technology, it's, there's no risks associated with it, or are you Zuckerberg, or are you, Elon, who is like deathly afraid of this? And this individual, fellow entrepreneur would not let me take the middle ground, which is where I tend to fall on this. And one of the things that really occurred to me in, thinking about this is that, I think if you think about Elon Musk and like who he is, he takes an incredibly long view of the world, probably more so than most of us, right? Like, you don't start a company to, bring humans into space if you're not thinking about the long view, right?
Right.
And the transformation that he's trying to do with he's not just building cars, right? He's trying to transform transportation. And that really made me think like, if you're really thinking about this question, from the perspective of, 100 years from now or 200 years from now or more, I think, and you have a sense for, both the power of the technology, and yes, it's immature now, but also It's another book I read. I forget the title of it. I think it was a book called Exponential Enterprise that I was listening to, and they talk about how often people miss the transformative effects of technologies because they think technology evolves linearly when in fact it tends to evolve exponentially. And if you think about AI from that perspective, right, we're in this shallow kind of linear looking part of the curve, but what happens when we turn that corner and the technology is advancing exponentially? It actually is rather threatening. Or at least, you can see where he's coming from.
Sure.
So I don't think, as like mainstream media, like typically is not sophisticated enough to, or at least the BuzzFeeds of the world, right? That, they're not sophisticated enough to really present that, argument. I tend to think that, AI, will very likely have, huge structural effects on our society, in terms of jobs, in terms of privacy, in terms of lots of things over the next, 25 years. And long term, it's something that we definitely need to be paying attention to and thinking about how we're going to regulate it. Like, think about, weaponized autonomous drones or even semi-autonomous drones. Like, I think the last thing that we need is to, give people, more of an ability to, to kill people and less of a connection to the actual act of it happening. Right. Yeah. Like it's just a recipe for disaster. And so, someone like Elon Musk, who's out there calling for that to be, regulated. Yeah, I think he's got a point. But I don't think that, for the most part, industry or media, does a great job of kind of talking about this. It's either, one pole or the other when I think, in fact, it's a really nuanced conversation that needs to happen.
Yeah. And so an example, it's a really subtle example, but an example I keep going back to is, I don't even remember who did it, but there was, it was Facebook, it was Google, it was one of them, and they were doing, had some bots that were effectively talking to each other and learning how to talk and pass information back and forth. And they trained them in natural language. And then one of the first things they actually did is they figured out a more effective way to transfer information back and forth, and they stopped using English. It was like, you'd look at the sentences they were communicating, and it was like a is, and it meant something to them. And they just completely ditched the English language, and everyone kind of shut the product down at that point because no one could understand what the heck they were doing. And I just thought I thought that was so fascinating.
It's fascinating, and it's a great example of how the media does that story injustice, right? It's like that was, these chatbots had, become sentient and were, conspiring against Facebook, and Facebook shut it down. When in fact it was like an experiment. They ran the experiment. It had some interesting effects. Nothing near sentience, but it was, an experiment that, just had a natural end time. So yeah, it's
And I think you highlight a really important thing, which is like, mankind has this incredible sort of survival technique. Like we figure out ways to survive and continue and so forth. But we also have this sort of incredible near-term thing to say, well, it's not really our fault that certain things are happening, right? Like no individual could, we sort of see this with the sort of global warming discussion, which is, well, individually, none of us could cause this problem. We couldn't create this. And we sort of go, okay, well, it can get ignored and so forth. But it is this, like you said, it's this great, do you look at it from the near term versus do you look at it from the short term? And what's the framing that you put that context in?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we're kind of at our time here. So Sam, let's go ahead and close this out. Beyond listening to your show each week, what are some good resources for listeners if they are interested in this topic, whether it's AI or machine learning or both? What is kind of your standard answer? Because I'm sure you get this a lot of how can folks go out and learn more?
Well, I'll start by giving folks a pointer to my show. If they're not pulling it up via searching on some podcast app, and we're, everywhere, including Google Home and Alexa, they can go to twimlai.com, which stands for This Week in Machine Learning and AI, TWIMLAI.com, and get links to all of or many of the major podcast listeners. Beyond my podcast, one of the places where I talk to so many people, that are in this space, data scientists, folks that are building this stuff, startups, big companies, and a ton of folks got their start through Andrew Ng's machine learning class at Stanford, the online, his MOOC. I did it back in 2012. I think I did it like the second time it was offered, and it continues to be available. And that's just one of a number of incredible resources out there in terms of classwork. So Andrew now has a company called deeplearning.ai that is doing a deep learning version of a class that is available. I think it's Coursera. There's fast.ai, which is kind of a deep learning class focused on developers with, so Andrew's thing is a little bit more kind of math and theory heavy, and this fast.ai is more, APIs and development heavy. And then, for any of the topics, like we cover a ton of different topics on the podcast, from everything from natural language to deep learning, to topics like, the thing that I was thinking of is escaping me, but evolutionary algorithms is an example of just kind of a one of these topics, and there you can find online coursework from major universities available to download, often watch lecture videos on YouTube. So there's a ton of like educational material out there. And one of the things that's great about the cloud, and folks that listen to this podcast will certainly appreciate this, is that the barrier to entry is really low. So, you can go sign up to, your favorite cloud service and play around with one of their image object detection APIs really easily. You just, send it some images and it'll tell you what's in them, and you can start to think about how you build those into applications. So one of the things that's great about the cloud vendors getting involved here is that they really have lowered the barrier to, playing around with this stuff.
No, that's very cool. It's nice because it gives folks a really nice broad range of, if you want to spend 30 or 45 minutes with you every week, you can listen to the podcast. If you want to sit down for some hours at night, you can do it as like you said, a MOOC or so lots of good input there, and we'll get all that stuff into the show notes for folks that are listening and don't remember that as they're running or exercising or whatever. So Sam, thank you so much for being on today. We know you're super busy, and I know we covered a lot of topics. The intention of the show was really just, we want to introduce it. We want to give folks a great resource in what you do every week, and allow people to kind of figure out, like, okay, where does this make sense? Where can they go explore and be curious and stuff? So, any last notes? Where can folks find you? Beyond the podcast, where can they find you on Twitter or maybe at an event or something like that?
Well, a couple of last things. One is, I want to again thank you guys, Brian and Aaron. In particular, Aaron gave me a lot of really good advice before I started the podcast, when I was, one of these guys curious about doing a podcast. So I definitely owe a lot to Aaron, and a huge shout out there. In terms of finding me, Twitter is always a great place, at Sam Charrington. And I'm sure there'll be a link to that in the show notes. You could also follow the podcast on Twitter at twimlai. Otherwise, easily accessible via the website I gave out earlier, LinkedIn, and a bunch of other places.
Very cool.
Fantastic.
Well, Aaron, you want to wrap it up? Take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sam, thank you so much for your time this week. And on behalf of Brian and myself, thanks for listening this week. And we'll talk to you next week. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.